It started innocently enough, just another day at work. I'd been feeling restless in my marriage, caught in the monotony of routine. My husband, Anthony, was a good man. He provided, he cared, and he never gave me a reason to doubt his love. But over the years, the thrill of being together had dulled. We had fallen into the same repetitive cycles: work, dinner, sleep, repeat. Our conversations revolved around bills, schedules, and errands, and the intimacy we once shared had faded into distant memories. At first, I thought it was just a phase, something all couples go through after years together. But as time dragged on, the emptiness grew. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it started, but I began to notice myself longing for something more. Not necessarily someone else, just a spark, a feeling of being desired, of being seen as more than just a wife or a partner. It wasn't that Anthony didn't love me, I knew he did, but somewhere along the way, we had stopped seeing each other as the people we once were. Then he came into my life, Ryan. He wasn't just attractive, he had an aura about him that immediately drew me in. It wasn't just his looks, although those were undeniable: tall, with a confident smile and an easy charm that made him impossible to ignore. It was the way he carried himself, like he knew exactly who he was, and wasn't afraid to show it. He radiated confidence, and I couldn't help but feel a pull toward him. Our first interaction was casual, just a polite exchange during a team meeting. But the way he spoke, the way his eyes lingered just a moment longer than necessary, it sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was nothing. People can be charismatic without it meaning anything, right? But deep down, I knew I hadn't felt this kind of attention in years. As the weeks went on, our interactions became more frequent. A shared laugh over a joke, a lingering glance across the office, and subtle compliments that seemed harmless but made my heart race. Ryan had a way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room when he spoke to me. It wasn't overtly flirtatious, at least not at first, but there was an undercurrent of something more. I started looking forward to work in a way I hadn't before. I'd spend extra time picking out my outfit, making sure my hair was just right, and even wearing perfume, a detail I hadn't paid attention to in years. The thought of seeing Ryan, of catching his smile or hearing his laugh, became the highlight of my day. Guilt began creeping in, but I pushed it aside. After all, I wasn't doing anything wrong. A little harmless admiration wasn't a crime, right? But deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. I started comparing him to Anthony, noticing all the ways Ryan made me feel alive and vibrant, while Anthony felt predictable and safe. I hated myself for thinking that way, but I couldn't help it. Ryan wasn't just a coworker anymore, he was a symbol of everything I felt was missing in my life. He represented excitement, passion, and a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. The more time I spent around him, the more I realized how much I craved that feeling. It was intoxicating, and even though I knew it was dangerous, I couldn't bring myself to let go. At night, I'd lie in bed next to Anthony, the weight of my thoughts pressing down on me. I wanted to tell him how I felt, to explain the emptiness I was struggling with, but I didn't know how. Would he even understand? Or would he just see it as a failure on my part, a sign that I wasn't trying hard enough to make things work? The truth was, I didn't want to admit that my feelings for Ryan were growing stronger. It was easier to blame the rut in my marriage, to tell myself that this was just a harmless escape. But deep down, I knew I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't take back. And as much as I tried to ignore it, the thrill of Ryan's presence was too powerful to resist. Over time, my thoughts about Ryan became harder to control. What started as a spark of curiosity turned into a flame that consumed me. I found myself replaying our interactions over and over in my mind: the way he smiled when he spoke to me, the way his voice carried a warmth that felt personal, almost intimate. At first, I told myself it was harmless. Fantasies are just that, aren't they? Daydreams. Nothing real. But with every passing day, the line between fantasy and reality blurred a little more. I started noticing how my heart would race at the thought of seeing him. It didn't matter if it was a quick conversation in the hallway or catching a glimpse of him across the office. Just being near him made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I began to crave those moments, small as they were. They were like stolen pieces of happiness, tucked away in the corners of my otherwise predictable life. It wasn't long before my thoughts about Ryan became more than fleeting. I'd catch myself imagining what it would be like to be with him in ways I had no business thinking. The scenarios played out vividly in my mind, his hand brushing against mine, his lips close to my ear, as he whispered something only I could hear. I'd feel a rush of heat and guilt, but the guilt never outweighed the thrill. At home, things with Anthony stayed the same, which only made the contrast more glaring. I couldn't remember the last time he looked at me the way Ryan did, with that spark of interest and intrigue. Anthony's love was steady, reliable, and routine. But Ryan's attention felt electric, charged with a kind of passion I didn't realize I'd been missing. I started dressing differently, paying more attention to how I presented myself. I told myself it was for me, that it felt good to put in the effort again. But deep down, I knew it wasn't for me. It was for Ryan. I wanted him to notice, to see me the way I imagined he might if only I gave him a reason. Then there were the compliments. Ryan had a way of saying things that felt just shy of crossing the line. He'd tell me I looked nice or that he admired how I handled a situation at work. They were subtle, casual, and delivered with a disarming smile. But those words stayed with me long after he walked away, feeding the fantasies I tried so hard to justify. The fantasies themselves became an escape. When the quiet suffocation of my marriage became too much, I'd retreat into those daydreams. They weren't just about Ryan. They were about what he represented: freedom, passion, and the chance to feel desired again. In those moments, I wasn't just a wife or a coworker. I was someone vibrant, someone alive, someone worthy of attention. But the deeper I sank into those fantasies, the more I started to wonder if they had to stay imaginary. What if there was a way to make them real? That thought terrified me and thrilled me in equal measure. It felt reckless and dangerous, like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing one wrong step could send me tumbling. But instead of pulling back, I found myself inching closer to the edge, drawn by the possibility of what might be waiting on the other side. As much as I tried to convince myself that I was in control, I wasn't. Ryan had become a constant presence in my mind, his charm lingering long after he was gone. And though I hadn't acted on those feelings yet, a part of me knew it was only a matter of time. The fantasy was too tempting, too perfect, and the real world felt too empty without it. The moment I crossed the line, it was almost too easy. I hadn't planned for it to happen, but the opportunity presented itself, and I didn't hesitate. Ryan invited me to lunch one day, casually suggesting we step out of the office for a break. I told myself it was innocent, just two colleagues grabbing a bite to eat, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't about lunch, it was about the unspoken tension that had been building between us. When we sat down, the conversation started as small talk, but it didn't stay there for long. Ryan had a way of making me feel at ease, of drawing me in with his words. He asked questions that felt personal, but not invasive, and I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't with anyone else, not even Anthony. I told him about my frustrations, my dreams, and the parts of my life that felt unfulfilled. Ryan listened intently, his eyes locked on mine, as though he genuinely cared about every word I said. It was intoxicating. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so seen, so understood. Anthony had always been a good listener, but over the years, our conversations had become more about logistics than emotions. With Ryan, it felt different, like he wanted to know me, not just the version of myself I showed the world. At one point during lunch, our hands brushed as we reached for the same napkin. It was such a small, insignificant moment, but the electricity it sent through me was undeniable. I froze for a second, unsure of what to do, but Ryan didn't pull away. Instead, his hand lingered, warm and steady, before he withdrew with a soft, almost knowing smile. That moment replayed in my mind 100 times later, each time sending a thrill through me. After lunch, I told myself it was just a friendly outing, but the truth was harder to ignore. Something had shifted between us. The lines I had carefully tried to maintain were beginning to blur. I knew I should pull back, create some distance, but I didn't want to. For the first time in years, I felt alive, desired, and utterly captivated. The next time Ryan asked me to lunch, I didn't hesitate. Our conversations grew deeper, more intimate, and the tension between us became impossible to ignore. I started to notice the way he looked at me, the way his eyes would linger just a little too long, or how his smile seemed meant just for me. And I liked it. I craved it. Then came the moment I couldn't take back. After one of our lunches, as we were walking back to the office, Ryan reached out and gently touched my arm. I turned to look at him, and before I could process what was happening, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a tentative kiss, it was deliberate, confident, and it set my heart racing. For a brief moment, the world fell away. All I could feel was the warmth of his lips, the strength of his hands, and the overwhelming sense of being wanted. When the kiss ended, we both stood there, breathless, staring at each other. I knew I should say something, pull away, or tell him it was a mistake. But I didn't. Instead, I let myself revel in the feeling, savoring the thrill of crossing a boundary I could never uncross. That kiss was the beginning of everything. It was the moment I let go of the life I thought I wanted and stepped into a world of secrets and temptation. I told myself it would only happen once, that it was just a fleeting moment of weakness. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Living a double life was both exhilarating and suffocating. With Ryan, I felt like a different person, fearless, adventurous, and completely untethered from the responsibilities that defined my life at home. When we were together, the world seemed brighter, every moment charged with an intensity I hadn't experienced in years. But when I returned home, the weight of what I was doing crashed down on me, filling every quiet moment with guilt and self-loathing. Anthony was as steady and trusting as ever, completely oblivious to the cracks forming beneath the surface of our marriage. He didn't question my late nights or the excuses I made about work commitments and social obligations. If anything, he seemed relieved that I was finally spending more time focusing on myself. It made the betrayal even harder to bear. Here was a man who loved me unconditionally, who believed in me, and I was lying to his face every single day. I told myself I could handle it, that I could compartmentalize my life and keep the two worlds from colliding. But the cracks were growing wider, and it was only a matter of time before everything would come crashing down. The lies came easier than I ever thought they would, each one more elaborate than the last. A last-minute meeting here, a weekend work trip there, I became a master of deception, weaving a web of half-truths that allowed me to keep seeing Ryan. But even as I relished the thrill of our stolen moments, a part of me couldn't ignore the cost. Anthony would sit across from me at dinner, smiling as he told me about his day, and I'd feel a pang of guilt so sharp it took my breath away. I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him everything and beg for forgiveness, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The thought of losing Ryan, of giving up the passion and excitement he brought into my life, was too much to bear. And then there was Ryan himself. He was everything Anthony wasn't: bold, unpredictable, and intoxicatingly confident. With him, I felt desired, alive, and utterly free. He didn't care about the details of my life outside of our time together. He wanted me, and that was enough. But there were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when I wondered if he ever thought about the consequences of what we were doing. Did he care about the damage we were causing? Or was I just another conquest for him, a temporary thrill that would fade as soon as the novelty wore off? Those thoughts haunted me in the quiet moments when I was alone and the weight of my choices pressed down on me. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, torn between the life I had and the life I was chasing. I knew I couldn't have both, but I wasn't ready to choose. The fantasy was too intoxicating, the reality too painful to face. Every time I thought about ending things with Ryan, I remembered the way he made me feel the fire in his touch, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. It was a feeling I couldn't bear to let go of, even as I watched the foundations of my marriage begin to crumble. Anthony trusted me completely, and that trust became a double-edged sword. It allowed me to continue the affair without suspicion, but it also made every lie feel like a knife to the heart. I'd catch glimpses of his face when he wasn't looking, the quiet contentment he carried, and it would break me. He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve me. But the truth was, I wasn't ready to stop. The affair had become an addiction, a lifeline I clung to in the midst of my unraveling life. I told myself I could keep it together, that I could keep my two worlds separate. But deep down, I knew the truth. Secrets don't stay buried forever, and mine were clawing their way to the surface. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The unraveling came slowly at first, like a crack in a dam spreading wider with every passing day. I'd been walking a tightrope, balancing my life with Anthony and my secret world with Ryan, but the weight of it all was becoming unbearable. The guilt, once an occasional pang, had grown into a constant ache, gnawing at me every time I looked into Anthony's eyes. He didn't know, but I could feel his growing unease. He would ask if I was okay, his voice tinged with concern, and I would smile and say I was just tired. It was a lie, of course, but lies had become my language. The affair with Ryan, once thrilling and new, had taken on a darker edge. Our time together no longer felt like an escape, it felt like a trap I had willingly walked into. Ryan was intoxicating, yes, but there was a selfishness to him that I hadn't seen before. He demanded more of my time, more of my energy, more of me. At first I gave it freely, caught up in the passion and excitement. But as the weeks turned into months, I began to feel the strain. Ryan didn't care about the consequences of our actions. He didn't have a life to dismantle or a marriage to lose. For him, this was uncomplicated, a fling, a thrill, something to spice up his days. But for me, it was a storm tearing through everything I'd built, threatening to destroy the life I'd once cherished. One night, Anthony confronted me not about the affair, but about the distance he'd started to feel between us. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, his eyes full of concern, and asked if I was happy. The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I couldn't speak. Was I happy? The truth was, I didn't know anymore. I wanted to tell him everything, to lay it all out and beg for his forgiveness. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I mumbled something about stress at work, another lie to add to the growing pile. Anthony nodded, his expression softening, and told me he was there for me, whatever I needed. His kindness was a knife to the heart, twisting deeper with every word. The next day, I met Ryan after work, determined to end things. I couldn't keep living this double life, it was tearing me apart. But when I saw him, all my resolve melted away. He smiled, that confident, disarming smile, and pulled me into his arms. For a moment, I let myself sink into the comfort of his embrace, pretending that everything was okay. But it wasn't. As much as I wanted to cling to the fantasy, reality was crashing down around me. The guilt, the lies, the constant fear of being found out, it was all too much. I couldn't keep doing this, not to Anthony, not to myself. That night, I sat in bed next to Anthony, my heart heavy with the weight of my secrets. He was already asleep, his breathing slow and steady, and I watched him in the dim light, tears streaming down my face. I didn't deserve his love, his trust, or the life we'd built together, but I couldn't bring myself to let it go either. In the end, the affair didn't end with a dramatic revelation or a fiery confrontation. It ended quietly, like a flame snuffed out by its own lack of oxygen. Ryan moved on, as I always knew he would, and I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. But the damage was done. The cracks in my marriage remained, a constant reminder of the choices I'd made and the lines I'd crossed. Anthony never found out, and I never told him. But the guilt stayed with me, a shadow I couldn't escape, a constant reminder of the life I almost lost in my search for something more.